This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Meredith Hughes, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. Chapter 11. The Hunting of the Man. It came before my mind, with an unreasonable hope of escape, that the outer door of my room was still open to me. I was convinced now, absolutely assured, that Moreau had been vivisecting a human being. All the time since I had heard his name, I had been trying to link in my mind in some way the grotesque animalism of the islanders with his abominations, and now I thought I saw it all. The memory of his works in the transfusion of blood recurred to me. These creatures I had seen were the victims of some hideous experiment. These sickening scoundrels had merely intended to keep me back, to fool me with their display of confidence, and presently to fall upon me with a fate more horrible than death, with torture, and after torture the most hideous degradation it was possible to conceive, to send me off, a lost soul, a beast, to the rest of their comus rout. I looked round for some weapon. Nothing. Then, with an inspiration, I turned over the deck-chair, put my foot on the side of it, and tore away the side-rail. It happened that a nail came away with the wood, and, projecting, gave a touch of danger to an otherwise petty weapon. I heard a step outside, incontinently flung open the door, and found Montgomery within a yard of it. He meant to lock the outer door. I raised this nailed stick of mine and cut at his face, but he sprang back. I hesitated a moment, then turned and fled round the corner of the house. "Prendick, man!" I heard his astonished cry. "Don't be a silly ass, man!" Another minute, thought I, and he would have had me locked in, and as ready as a hospital rabbit for my fate. He emerged behind the corner, for I heard him shout "Prendick!" Then he began to run after me, shouting things as he ran. This time, running blindly, I went northeastward, in a direction at right angles to my previous expedition. Once, as I went running headlong up the beach, I glanced over my shoulder and saw his attendant with him. I ran furiously up the slope, over it, then turned eastward along a rocky valley, fringed on either side with jungle. I ran perhaps a mile altogether, my chest straining, my heart beating in my ears, and then, hearing nothing of Montgomery or his man, and feeling upon the verge of exhaustion, I doubled sharply back towards the beach, as I judged, and lay down in the shelter of a cane-brake. There I remained for a long time, too fearful to move, and indeed too fearful even to plan a course of action. The wild scene about me lay sleeping silently under the sun, and the only sound near me was the thin hum of some small gnats that had discovered me. Presently I became aware of a drowsy breathing sound, the soughing of the sea upon the beach. After about an hour I heard Montgomery shouting my name far away to the north. That set me thinking of my plan of action. As I interpreted it then, this island was inhabited only by these two vivisectors and their animalized victims. Some of these, no doubt, they could press into their service against me, if need arose. I knew both Moreau and Montgomery carried revolvers, and save for a feeble bar of deal spiked with a small nail, the merest mockery of a mace, I was unarmed. So I lay still where I was until I began to think of food and drink. And at that moment the real hopelessness of my position came home to me. I knew no way of getting anything to eat. I was too ignorant of botany to discover any resort of root or fruit that might lie about me. I had no means of trapping the few rabbits upon the island. It grew blanker the more I turned the prospect over. At last, in the desperation of my position, my mind turned to the animal men I had encountered. I tried to find some hope in what I remembered of them. In turn I recalled each one I had seen, and tried to draw some augury of assistance from my memory. Then, suddenly, I heard a staghound bay, and at that realized a new danger. I took little time to think, or they would have caught me then, but snatching up my nailed stick, rushed headlong from my hiding-place towards the sound of the sea. I remember a growth of thorny plants with spines that stabbed like penknives. I emerged bleeding and with torn clothes upon the lip of a long creek opening northward. I went straight into the waves without a minute's hesitation, wading up the creek and presently finding myself knee-deep in a little stream. I scrambled out at last on the westward bank, and, with my heart beating loudly in my ears, crept into a tangle of ferns to await the issue. I heard the dog, it was only one, draw nearer and yelp when it came to the thorns. Then I heard no more, and presently began to think I had escaped. The minutes passed, the silence lengthened out, and at last, after an hour of security, my courage began to return to me. By this time I was no longer very terrified or very miserable, for I had, as it were, passed the limits of terror and despair. I felt now that my life was practically lost, and that persuasion made me capable of daring anything. I had even a certain wish to encounter Moreau face to face. And as I had waded in the water, I remembered that if I were too hard pressed at least one path of escape from torment still lay open to me. They could not very well prevent me from drowning myself. I had half a mind to drown myself then, but an odd wish to see the whole adventure out, a queer, impersonal, spectacular interest in myself, restrained me. I stretched my limbs, sore and painful from the pricks of the spiny plants, and stared around me at the trees. And so suddenly that it seemed to jump out of the green tracery about it, my eyes lit upon a black face watching me. I saw that it was the simian creature who had met the launch upon the beach. He was clinging to the oblique stem of a palm tree. I gripped my stick and stood up facing him. He began chattering. You, was all I could distinguish at first. Suddenly he dropped from the tree, and in another moment was holding the fronds apart and staring curiously at me. I did not feel the same repugnance toward this creature that I had experienced in my encounters with the other beast men. You, he said, in the boat. He was a man, then, at least as much of a man as Montgomery's attendant, for he could talk. Yes, I said, I came in the boat, from the ship. Oh, he said, and his bright, restless eyes traveled over me, to my hands, to the stick I carried, to my feet, to the tattered places in my coat, and the cuts and scratches I had received from the thorns. He seemed puzzled at something. His eyes came back to my hands. He held his own hand out, and counted his digits slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, eh? I did not grasp his meaning then. Afterwards I was to find that a great proportion of these beast people had malformed hands lacking sometimes even 3 digits. But, guessing this was in some way a greeting, I did the same thing by way of reply. He grinned with immense satisfaction. Then his quick, roving glance went round again. He made a swift movement and vanished. The fern fronds he had stood between came swishing together. I pushed out of the brake after him, and was astonished to find him swinging cheerfully by one lank arm from a rope of creepers that looped down from the foliage overhead. His back was to me. "Hullo," said I. He came down with a twisting jump and stood facing me. "I say," said I, "where can I get something to eat?" "Eat," he said. "Eat man's food now." And his eyes went back to the swing of ropes. "At the huts." "But where are the huts?" "Oh! I'm new, you know." At that he swung round and set off at a quick walk. All his motions were curiously rapid. "Come along," said he. I went with him to see the adventure out. I guessed the huts were some rough shelter where he and some more of these beast people lived. I might perhaps find them friendly, find some handle in their minds to take hold of. I did not know yet how far they were from the human heritage I ascribed to them. My ape-like companion trotted along by my side, with his hands hanging down and his jaw thrust forward. I wondered what memory he might have in him. "How long have you been on this island?" said I. "How long?" he asked. And, after having the question repeated, he held up 3 fingers. The creature was little better than an idiot. I tried to make out what he meant by that, and it seems I bored him. After another question or two, he suddenly left my side and sprang at some fruit that hung from a tree. He pulled down a hand of prickly husks and went on eating the contents. I noted this with satisfaction, for here, at least, was a hint for feeding. I tried him with some other questions, but his chattering, prompt responses were, as often as not, at cross purposes with my questions. Some few were appropriate, others quite parrot-like. I was so intent upon these peculiarities that I scarcely noticed the path we followed. Presently we came to trees, all charred and brown, and so to a bare place covered with a yellow-white incrustation, across which went a drifting smoke, pungent in whiffs to nose and eyes. On our right, over a shoulder of bare rock, I saw the level blue of the sea. The path coiled down abruptly into a narrow ravine between 2 tumbled and knotty masses of blackish scoriae. Into this we plunged. It was extremely dark, this passage, after the blinding sunlight reflected from the sulphurous ground. Its walls grew steep and approached one another. Blotches of green and crimson drifted across my eyes. My conductor stopped suddenly. "Home," said he, and I stood in a floor of a chasm that was at first absolutely dark to me. I heard some strange noises, and thrust the knuckles of my left hand into my eyes. I became aware of a disagreeable odor like that of a monkey's cage ill-cleaned. Beyond, the rock opened again, upon a gradual slope of sunlit greenery, and on either hand the light smote down through a narrow channel into the central gloom. End of Chapter 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Meredith Hughes, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. Chapter 12. The Sayers of the Law. Then something cold touched my hand. I started violently, and saw close to me a dim pinkish thing, looking more like a flayed child than anything else in the world. The creature had exactly the mild but repulsive features of a sloth, the same low forehead and slow gestures. As the first shock of the change of light passed, I saw about me more distinctly. The little sloth-like creature was standing and staring at me. My conductor had vanished. The place was a narrow passage between high walls of lava, a crack in its knotted flow, and on either side interwoven heaps of sea-mat, palm fans and reeds leaning against the rock, formed rough and impenetrably dark dens. The winding way up the ravine between these was scarcely 3 yards wide, and was disfigured by lumps of decaying fruit pulp and other refuse which accounted for the disagreeable stench of the place. The little pink sloth creature was still blinking at me when my ape-man reappeared at the aperture of the nearest of these dens and beckoned me in. As he did so, a slouching monster wriggled out of one of the places further up this strange street, and stood up in featureless silhouette against the bright green beyond, staring at me. I hesitated, had half a mind to bolt the way I had come, and then, determined to go through with the adventure, gripped my nailed stick about the middle, and crawled into the little evil-smelling lean-to after my conductor. It was a semicircular space, shaped like the half of a beehive, and against the rocky wall that formed the inner side of it was a pile of variegated fruits, coconuts, and others. Some rough vessels of lava and wood stood about the floor, and one on a rough stool. There was no fire. In the darkest corner of the hut sat a shapeless mass of darkness that grunted "Hey!" as I came in, and my ape-man stood in the dim light of the doorway and held out a split coconut to me as I crawled into the other corner and squatted down. I took it and began gnawing it, as serenely as possible in spite of my tense trepidation and the nearly intolerable closeness of the den. The little pink sloth creature stood in the aperture of the hut, and something else with a drab face and bright eyes came staring over its shoulder. "Hey!" came out of the lump of mystery opposite. "It is a man! It is a man!" gabbled my conductor. "A man! A man! A live man, like me!" "Shut up!" said the voice from the dark, and grunted. I gnawed my coconut amid an impressive silence. I peered hard into the blackness, but could distinguish nothing. "It is a man," the voice repeated. "He comes to live with us?" It was a thick voice with something in it, a kind of whistling overtone that struck me as peculiar, but the English accent was strangely good. The ape-man looked at me as though he had expected something. I perceived the pause was interrogative. "He comes to live with you," I said. "It is a man. He must learn the law." I began to distinguish now a deeper blackness in the black, a vague outline of a hunched-up figure. Then I noticed the opening of the place was darkened by 2 more heads. My hand tightened on my stick. The thing in the dark repeated in a louder tone, "Say the words!" I had missed its last remark. "Not to go on all fours, that is the law," it repeated in a kind of sing-song. I was puzzled. "Say the words!" said the ape-man, repeating, and the figures in the doorway echoed this with a threat in the tone of their voices. I realized I had to repeat this idiotic formula. And then began the insanest ceremony. The voice in the dark began intoning a mad litany, line by line, and I and the rest to repeat it. As they did so, they swayed from side to side, and beat their hands upon their knees, and I followed their example. I could have imagined I was already dead and in another world. The dark hut, these grotesque dim figures just flecked here and there by a glimmer of light, and all of them swaying in unison and chanting. "Not to go on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to suck up drink, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to eat flesh or fish, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to claw bark of trees, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to chase other men, that is the law. Are we not men?" And so from the prohibition of these acts of folly, on to the prohibition of what I thought then were the maddest, most impossible, and most indecent things one could well imagine. A kind of rhythmic fervor fell on all of us. We gabbled and swayed faster and faster, repeating this amazing law. Superficially the contagion of these brute men was upon me, but deep down within me laughter and disgust struggled together. We ran through a long list of prohibitions, and then the chant swung round to a new formula. "His is the house of pain, his is the hand that makes, his is the hand that wounds, his is the hand that heals." And so on for another long series, mostly quite incomprehensible gibberish to me about him, whoever he might be. I could have fancied it was a dream, but never before have I heard chanting in a dream. "His is the lightning flash," we sang, "his is the deep salt sea." A horrible fancy came into my head that Moreau, after animalizing these men, had infected their dwarfed brains with a kind of deification of himself. However, I was too keenly aware of white teeth and strong claws about me to stop my chanting on that account. "His are the stars in the sky." At last the song ended. I saw the ape-man's face shining with perspiration, and my eyes being now accustomed to the darkness, I saw more distinctly the figure in the corner from which the voice came. It was the size of a man, but it seemed covered with a dull grey hair, almost like a Skye terrier. What was it? What were they all? Imagine yourself surrounded by all the most horrible cripples and maniacs it is possible to conceive, and you may understand a little of my feelings with these grotesque caricatures of humanity about me. "He is a 5-man, a 5-man, a 5-man, like me," said the 8-man. I held out my hands. The gray creature in the corner leaned forward. "Not to run on all fours. That is the law. Are we not men?" he said. He put out a strangely distorted talon and gripped my fingers. The thing was almost like the hoof of a deer produced into claws. I could have yelled with surprise and pain. His face came forward and peered at my nails, came forward into the light of the opening of the hut, and I saw with a quivering disgust that it was like the face of neither man nor beast, but a mere shock of gray hair with 3 shadowy overarchings to mark the eyes and the mouth. "He has little nails," said this grisly creature in his hairy beard. "It is well. Many are troubled with big nails." He threw my hand down, and instinctively I gripped my stick. "Eat roots and herbs. It is his will," said the 8-man. "I am the sayer of the law," said the gray figure. "Here come all that be new, to learn the law. I sit in the darkness and say the law." "It is even so," said one of the beasts in the doorway. "Evil are the punishments of those who break the law. None escape." "None escape," said the beast folk, glancing furtively at each other. "None, none," said the 8-man. "None escape. See, I did a little thing, a wrong thing once. I jabbered, stopped talking. None could understand. I am burnt, branded in the hand. He is great, he is good." "None escape," said the great creature in the corner. "None escape," said the beast people, looking askance at one another. "For every one the want that is bad," said the gray sayer of the law. "What you will want we do not know. We shall know. Some want to follow things that move, to watch and slink and wait and spring, to kill and bite deep and rich, sucking the blood. It is bad. Not to chase other men, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to eat flesh nor fish, that is the law. Are we not men?" "None escape," said a dappled brute standing in the doorway. "For every one the want that is bad," said the gray sayer of the law. "Some want to go tearing with teeth and hands into the roots of things, snuffing into the earth. It is bad." "None escape," said the men in the door. "Some go clawing trees, some go scratching at the graves of the dead, some go fighting with foreheads or feet or claws, some bite suddenly, none giving occasion, some love uncleanness." "None escape," said the 8-man, scratching his calf. "None escape," said the little pink sloth creature. "Punishment is sharp and sure. Therefore learn the law. Say the words." And incontinently he began again the strange litany of the law, and again I and all those creatures began singing and swaying. My head reeled with this jabbering and the close stench of the place, but I kept on, trusting to find presently some chance of a new development. "Not to go on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men?" We were making such a noise that I noticed nothing of a tumult outside until someone, who I think was one of the 2 swine men I had seen, thrust his head over the little pink sloth creature and shouted something excitedly, something that I did not catch. Incontinently those at the opening of the hut vanished. My 8-man rushed out, the thing that had sat in the dark followed him. I only observed it was big and clumsy and covered with silvery hair, and I was left alone. Then, before I reached the aperture, I heard the yelp of a staghound. In another moment I was standing outside the hovel, my chair rail in my hand, every muscle of me quivering. Before me were the clumsy backs of perhaps a score of these beast people, their misshapen heads half hidden by their shoulder blades. They were gesticulating excitedly. Other half-animal faces glared interrogation out of the hovels. Looking in the direction in which they faced, I saw coming through the haze under the trees beyond the end of the passage of dens the dark figure and awful white face of Moreau. He was holding the leaping staghound back, and close behind him came Montgomery, revolver in hand. For a moment I stood horror-struck. I turned and saw the passages behind me blocked by another heavy brute with a huge grey face and twinkling little eyes, advancing towards me. I looked round and saw to the right of me, and half a dozen yards in front of me, a narrow gap in the wall of rock, through which a ray of light slanted into the shadows. "Stop!" cried Moreau, as I strode toward this, and then, "Hold him!" At that, first one face turned toward me, and then others. Their bestial minds were happily slow. I dashed my shoulder into a clumsy monster who was turning to see what Moreau meant, and flung him forward into another. I felt his hands fly round, clutching at me and missing me. The little pink sloth creature dashed at me, and I cut it over, gashed down its ugly face with the nail in my stick, and in another minute I was scrambling up a steep side pathway, a kind of sloping chimney, out of the ravine. I heard a howl behind me, and cries of "Catch him! Hold him!" and the grey-faced creature appeared behind me and jammed his huge bulk into the cleft. "Go on! Go on!" they howled. I clambered up the narrow cleft in the rock, and came out upon the sulphur on the westward side of the village of the Beast Men. I ran over the white space and down a steep slope through a scattered growth of trees, and came to a low-lying stretch of tall reeds. Through this I pushed into a dark, thick undergrowth that was black and succulent underfoot. That gap was altogether fortunate for me, for the narrow way slanting obliquely upward must have impeded the nearer pursuers. As I plunged into the reeds the foremost had only just emerged from the gap. I broke my way through this undergrowth for some minutes. The air behind me and about me was soon full of threatening cries. I heard the tumult of my pursuers in the gap up the slope, then the crashing of the reeds, and every now and then the crackling of a branch. Some of the creatures roared like excited beasts of prey. The staghound yelped to the left. I heard Moreau and Montgomery shouting in the same direction. I turned sharply to the right. It seemed to me even then that I heard Montgomery shouting for me to run for my life. Presently the ground gave, rich and oozy under my feet. But I was desperate, and went headlong into it, struggled through knee-deep, and so came to a winding path among tall canes. The noise of my pursuers passed away to my left. In one place 3 strange pink hopping animals, about the size of cats, bolted before my footsteps. The pathway ran uphill, across another open space covered with white incrustation, and plunged into a canebrake again. Then suddenly it turned parallel with the edge of a steep-walled gap, which came without warning like the ha-ha of an English park, turned with unexpected abruptness. I was still running with all my might, and I never saw this drop until I was flying headlong through the air. I fell on my forearms and head among thorns, and rose with a torn ear and bleeding face. I had fallen into a precipitous ravine, rocky and thorny, full of a hazy mist that drifted about me in wisps, and with a narrow streamlet, from which this mist came, meandering down the center. I was astonished at this thin fog in the full blaze of daylight, but I had no time to stand wondering then. I turned to my right downstream, hoping to come to the sea in that direction, and so have my way open to drown myself. It was only later I found that I had dropped my nailed stick in my fall. Presently the ravine grew narrower for a space, and carelessly I stepped into the stream. I jumped out again pretty quickly, for the water was almost boiling. I noticed, too, there was a thin sulphurous scum drifting upon its coiling water. Almost immediately came a turn in the ravine and the indistinct blue horizon. The nearer sea was flashing the sun from a myriad facets. I saw my death before me. But I was hot and panting. I felt more than a touch of exultation, too, at having distanced my pursuers. It was not in me then to go out and drown myself. My blood was too warm. I stared back the way I had come. I listened. Save for the hum of gnats and the chirp of some small insects that hopped above the thorns, the air was absolutely still. Then came the yelp of a dog, very faint, and a chattering and gibbering, the snap of a whip and voices. They grew louder, then fainter again. The noise receded up the stream and faded away. For a while the chase was over. But I knew now how much hope of help for me lay in the beast people. End of chapter 12.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. Chapter 13. A Parley. I turned again and went on down towards the sea. I found the hot stream broadened out to a shallow weedy sand, in which an abundance of crabs and long-bodied, many-legged creatures started from my footfall. I walked to the very edge of the salt water, and then I felt I was safe. I turned and stared, arms akimbo, at the thick green behind me, into which the steamy ravine cut like a smoking gash. But, as I say, I was too full of excitement, and, a true saying, though those who have never known danger may doubt it, too desperate to die. Then it came into my head that there was one chance before me yet. While Moreau and Montgomery and their bestial rabble chased me through the island, might I not go round the beach until I came to their enclosure, make a flank march upon them, in fact, and then, with a rock lugged out of their loosely built wall perhaps, smash in the lock of the smaller door, and see what I could find, knife, pistol, or what not, to fight them with when they returned. It was, at any rate, something to try. So I turned to the westward, and walked along by the water's edge. The setting sun flashed his blinding heat into my eyes. The slight Pacific tide was running in with a gentle ripple. Presently the shore fell away southward, and the sun came round upon my right hand. Then, suddenly, far in front of me, I saw first one and then several figures emerging from the bushes: Moreau, with his grey staghound, then Montgomery, and two others. At that I stopped. They saw me, and began gesticulating and advancing. I stood watching them approach. The two beast men came running forward to cut me off from the undergrowth inland. Montgomery came, running also, but straight towards me. Moreau followed slower with the dog. At last I roused myself from my inaction, and turning seaward, walked straight into the water. The water was very shallow at first. I was 30 yards out before the waves reached my waist. Dimly I could see the intertidal creatures darting away from my feet. "What are you doing, man?" cried Montgomery. I turned, standing waist deep, and stared at them. Montgomery stood panting at the margin of the water. His face was bright red with exertion, his long flaxen hair blown about his head, and his dropping nether lip showed his irregular teeth. Moreau was just coming up, his face pale and firm, and the dog at his hand barked at me. Both men had heavy whips. Farther up the beach stared the beast men. "What am I doing? I'm going to drown myself," said I. Montgomery and Moreau looked at each other. "Why?" asked Moreau. "Because that is better than being tortured by you." "I told you so," said Montgomery, and Moreau said something in a low tone. "What makes you think I shall torture you?" asked Moreau. "What I saw," I said, "and those yonder." "Hush," said Moreau, and held up his hand. "I will not," said I. "They were men. What are they now? I at least will not be like them." I looked past my interlocutors. Up the beach were Meling, Montgomery's attendant, and one of the white swathed brutes from the boat. Farther up, in the shadow of the trees, I saw my little ape-man, and behind him some other dim figures. "Who are these creatures?" said I, pointing to them and raising my voice more and more that it might reach them. "They were men, men like yourselves, whom you have infected with some bestial taint, men whom you have enslaved, and whom you still fear. You who listen," I cried, pointing now to Moreau, and shouting past him to the beast men, "you who listen, Do you not see these men still fear you, go in dread of you? Why then do you fear them? You are many." "For God's sake," cried Montgomery, "stop that, Prendick!" "Prendick!" cried Moreau. They both shouted together, as if to drown my voice, and behind them lowered the staring faces of the beast men, wondering, their deformed hands hanging down, their shoulders hunched up. They seemed, as I fancied, to be trying to understand me, to remember, I thought, something of their human past. I went on shouting, I scarcely remember what. That Moreau and Montgomery could be killed, that they were not to be feared, that was the burden of what I put into the heads of the beast people. I saw the green-eyed man, in the dark rags, who had met me on the evening of my arrival, come out from among the trees, and others followed him to hear me better. At last, for want of breath, I paused. "Listen to me for a moment," said the steady voice of Moreau, "and then say what you will." "Well?" said I. He coughed, thought, then shouted, "Latin, Prendick, bad Latin, schoolboy Latin, but try and understand. He non sunt homines, sunt animalia qui nos habemus, vivisected, a humanizing process. I will explain. Come ashore." I laughed. "A pretty story," said I. "They talk, build houses. They were men. It's likely I'll come ashore. The water just beyond where you stand is deep, and full of sharks." "That's my way," said I, "short and sharp presently." "Wait a minute." He took something out of his pocket that flashed back the sun, and dropped the object at his feet. "That's a loaded revolver," said he. "Montgomery here will do the same. Now we are going up the beach until you are satisfied the distance is safe. Then come and take the revolvers." "Not I. You have a third between you." "I want you to think over things, Prendick. In the first place, I never asked you to come upon this island. If we vivisected men, we should import men, not beasts. In the next, we had you drugged last night. Had we wanted to work you any mischief? And in the next, now your first panic is over and you can think a little, is Montgomery here quite up to the character you give him? We have chased you for your good, because this island is full of inimical phenomena. Besides, why should we want to shoot you when you've just offered to drown yourself? Why did you set your people onto me when I was in the hut?" "We felt sure of catching you and bringing you out of danger. Afterwards we drew away from the scent, for your good." I mused. It seemed just possible. Then I remembered something again. "But I saw," said I, "in the enclosure—" That was the puma. "Look here, Prendick," said Montgomery, "you're a silly ass. Come out of the water and take these revolvers and talk. We can't do anything more than we could do now." I will confess that then, and indeed always, I distrusted and dreaded Moreau, but Montgomery was a man I felt I understood. "Go up the beach," said I after thinking, and added, "holding your hands up." "Can't do that," said Montgomery, with an explanatory nod over his shoulder. "Undignified." "Go up to the trees then," said I, "as you please." "It's a damned silly ceremony," said Montgomery. Both turned, and faced the 6 or 7 grotesque creatures who stood there in the sunlight, solid, casting shadows, moving, and yet so incredibly unreal. Montgomery cracked his whip at them, and forthwith they all turned and fled helter-skelter into the trees, and when Montgomery and Moreau were at a distance I judged sufficient, I waded ashore, and picked up and examined the revolvers. To satisfy myself against the subtlest trickery, I discharged one at a round lump of lava, and had the satisfaction of seeing the stone pulverized and the beach splashed with lead. Still I hesitated for a moment. "I'll take the risk," said I at last, and with a revolver in each hand I walked up the beach towards them. "That's better," said Moreau, without affectation. "As it is, you have wasted the best part of my day with your confounded imagination." And with a touch of contempt which humiliated me, he and Montgomery turned and went on in silence before me. The knot of beast men still wondering stood back among the trees. I passed them as serenely as possible. One started to follow me, but retreated again when Montgomery cracked his whip. The rest stood silent, watching. They may once have been animals, but I never before saw an animal trying to think. End of chapter 13.